It was such an unexpected turn of events.
To misquote what Churchill said about democracy, it's a hell of a lot better than the other alternatives.
It was the product of struggle, of dreams, of imagination, and intense collegiality and intelligence.
The Constitution still is the glue that holds the South African society together.
A negotiation is in many senses only as good as its process. My guest today was crucial for the process in the negotiations for both the interim and final constitutions. Before that, however, he was crucial in forwarding and organizing the underground ANC resistance to apartheid, spending much of his life in exile. His bravery during this period was only matched by his desire to see positive changes in our homeland. Once the ANC was unbanned and he could return home, he dedicated himself to first building up the legal presence of the party and then overseeing the internal negotiation process for the ANC constitutional negotiation team as the national coordinator of the ANC negotiations. After the 1994 elections, he was elected to the Gauteng legislature, but quickly moved away from that position to oversee the final constitutional negotiation process as the executive director of the Constitutional Assembly, a role in which he excelled, setting a new standard for international best practice. Hassen Ebrahim is a public servant to the core, and his life and career are a shining example of what service to this country truly means. So it is my honor today to talk to him about all the ways that he has served South Africa. Hello, Mr. Ebrahim. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. All well. Hope you're well too.
Thank you so much. I am doing well. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a personal history. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in a place called Marabastad, famous for the Marabi music. It's out in Pretoria alongside the Apis River. The Apis River, which was made famous because we are told that Winston Churchill swam it to his freedom. But that's where I grew up. Quite an interesting location.
And where did you go to school?
In Marabastad as well. It was a very small area. It was sort of a couple of kilometers squared, and that's where the Indian community were located. Alongside, to the north, we had an African community, and to the south, we had a colored community with the Apis River cutting across, and opposite the Apis River were a poor white community which was located there, based mainly civil servants.
And so I think the separation of the races that you outlined, I think, lead perfectly into my next question. Because what was it like growing up for you? What was like growing up during apartheid for you?
It had severe limitations and challenges which we only really understood properly as we grew up and grew out of. But having grown up in the environment, it was a norm to be restricted to a particular area, not to be able to go to basic recreational facilities, whether it be the movies or parks or whatever it is. But that was a norm and we understood and accepted it. It became difficult. Like I described to you, Marabastad, to get to town, to do shopping in town, you had to cross the river, pass through a white community, and then go into the city. And often enough, you'd get attacked and brutalized. So it had its challenges, but we must not make Marabastad the experience there all doom and gloom, because there's a very curious human response to the hardship and difficulties. People find ways in which to actually gel and come together in a much more stronger communal spirit which I think made it easier to understand, or not so much understand, but to cope with uh, the difficulties of apartheid. But yes, apartheid was a very difficult experience.
And one of the specific ways that you were affected by apartheid, I believe, was directly by the Group Areas Act, because the government decided to break apart Marabastat. And how did this affect your political consciousness at the time?
Well, significantly. Remember that when we grew up, our political consciousness was ever present. It was more the norm than anything else we understood. We grew up with the elders talking about their experiences and talking about apartheid and talking about political issues and so on. And we would listen and understand and become aware. Uh,
Mm.
the experience itself was very, very real. Uh, but the Group Areas Act was of an enormous impact to the Indian community, alongside also the colored community and the African community, because each of these communities were flung to different parts of Pretoria. Uh, the colored community went to a place called Easters. We went to a place called Laudium. The African community went to a place either called either Artridgeville or Mamelodi or one of the other areas. So, in a sense, a broader community was split up even further and pulled asunder. Uh, but the big challenge of apartheid and the Group Areas Act and the resistance to it was that it took us further away from places of employment, which meant that getting to employment to people who were employed, it made it much more difficult for them to get to. Talking about, though, the effects of apartheid on our consciousness, political consciousness, one of the issues that it did is that when we went to schooling in Marabastat, the question was, where would we go to university? And there was a big debate as we grew up, because there were limited colleges that were available to us. And the only place that was available to us was in Westville. And so you found a great resistance towards going to Westville University, because it was a bush college. And so as I grew up, it was a battle with my father to get me to leave, to either go to a college that was generally accepted, or to travel abroad and to go to a college. But of course, my father couldn't afford it. And that financial and economic reality became a very real constraining factor, and prevented me from doing anything other than going to the Bush College, which I'd resisted. So there's a great deal of resistance to that. But I thought I'd just add that in terms of our consciousness.
And you do end up, though, actually not attending the Bush College, but go instead to Wits University. So how did you end up, how did that transition happen?
Well, yes. 1976, I was at Westville University, but we basically, after the boycotts and the student uprisings in June
Mm.
1976, we left, or I left Westville University, came back home. And towards the end of the year, we discovered that Wits University offered a very unique opportunity and a sort of a gap, as it were,
Mm.
provided we were provided we applied for a degree which had as a major that was not offered at the Bush College, we would gain entry. It would be a basis on which we would then be allowed to get admission into Wits. And that's how we got admitted to Wits. So we got into Wits University, and I started studying there until 1979, yes.
And in Wits University, it was the first time in which you, I believe, actively started to work and build the ANC's underground structures. So how did you get involved with the ANC, and what were you doing on campus to build the underground structures?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think After my experience in 1976 at Westville, we were clearly politicized and we were eager to become part of the struggle. And the question was really, if you weren't part of the struggle, you were really almost against it. There was no choice of remaining outside. One had to get involved to do what was required. It was almost an imperative. And at Wits University, I fortunately found a student friend uh, who had studied, who did his schooling in Botswana, and through asking questions, was given the contact details of a senior ANC operative, a cadre by the name of Marius Koen, who is now late. But Marius Koen was based in Botswana as a teacher, and I went out to visit him there and made contact with the ANC and started working. He convinced me that getting involved in a military struggle immediately was not quite the right thing. What I should be doing was to get involved politically within the community and within my environment. So, propaganda of the ANC, underground propaganda, banned propaganda, was basically the big issue. The first part of it was political education for our own self so that we understood and could analyze the situation much more carefully and effectively. And the second part of it was to make sure that we brought the same political ideas to the community around. And so, yes, we got involved at Wits University. The usual stuff we did in the early days was distributing leaflets. We had very interesting stickers that we would put up at different parts of the campuses and so on. And we used to distribute books which were camouflaged in as Reader's Digest, if you'd believe it. But you'd had different political material dressed up in different covers and so on, which we then distributed and became quite effective and gained quite a broad readership in the student community, because there was a yearning for information and education, and we provided that service. So in a sense, from the underground unit, providing literature and information was a very big issue, and to do so securely was a major challenge. But that's what occupied our time mostly.
And I was wondering, I read your book, and in it you have this little paragraph in which you describe that every week you would meet with the two people you were working with to spread the propaganda, to go and have political discussions. And so, what exactly did the political discussions entail? What was your political education at that time?
Well, it was actually a very important part of our learning experience. I don't find that same political education taking place currently. Back then, political education was a big part of playing a role in organizations like the African National Congress. So being inducted to the ANC wasn't just gaining membership and saying, yay, I'm a member. The issue was to be able to understand, and to understand we needed to have a proper political a sense of the political tools. Back then, a major article, we used to read several set works, if you like, and articles. The one was on strategy and tactics, which helped us understand really the strategy of the struggle, and what tactics to apply, and how to deal with it, but also provide basic analytical tools. The second article I remember that was very popular then as well and very important to us was an article by Joe Slover, which was then distributed quite widely. It was called No Middle Road, which then explained really how one should undertake or understand the struggle, and how one could locate one's own role within that. And then there were a series of other articles which we would then read and discuss in our meetings. And part of that would then be how would we take what knowledge we had gained and impart that to the to other students, colleagues, friends, and people, but doing so secretively without people actually knowing where the materials came from. And beyond that, we would also then start producing our own materials. So leaflets and materials, analyzing local conditions, using the political understanding that we had, and providing leadership in terms of understanding what is it that people could do to respond to the challenges that people were experiencing. So that's basically what we would do in our political education meetings.
And one of the things that really struck me, especially, and struck me when talking to people for this series, is that the apartheid government was far more lenient in persecuting and going after people who worked within the system, but they were incredibly aggressive when it came to people who worked outside of the apartheid system. And you saw quite a lot of you and a lot of your cadres that you worked with and your colleagues saw a lot of the more severe and violent parts of the apartheid state. And so how did you handle the issue of personal security, and were there any moments that particularly stand out in your memory as being an exemplar of the aggressive nature of the apartheid state?
Yeah. Bear in mind that at the time, until 1979, when I left the country, I was still very young. And at that time, we had a bravado, a bravery, not quite, we weren't reckless, we weren't careless, but we were quite self-confident. Uh, in the early times, we hadn't personally experienced the brutality that came later. So when we started off, we were quite brave in doing what we needed to do. So it I used to travel very frequently from Laudium, where we lived, into Fort Trekkerhoogte, which is now called Tabachwani, which was the headquarters of the military, where had managed to recruit a cadre who was working in a signals room. And so I would frequently go in to Fort Trekkerhoogte and be able to retrieve confidential military intelligence and get out without actually understanding how dangerous it really was. So at the first bit, I didn't quite understand it until towards the end of middle of 1979, when Rocky was a cadre that I recruited, got arrested and he was detained. And that made us immediately aware that we were involved in fairly dangerous activities. Uh, I needed to understand it and experience it to actually know it. Hearing of it wasn't good enough. But when I contacted the ANC in Botswana, they immediately told me that I was at risk and it would be a further risk for me to remain in the country, not only for myself, but the people I worked with, only because I would carry the information of all the other people I was in touch with. So I would put other people at risk if I were arrested. So I was then given instructions to leave the country. And that was the first time I understood how traumatic the impact would be. Uh, and going out into exile was a particularly traumatic experience, one that I'll never forget, and one that my colleagues and comrades that I worked with would never forget either. But getting into Botswana is when we saw the naked brutality and when we were exposed to real dangers and challenges and difficulties in many different ways. So yeah, it we got exposed to different people coming through the borders and listening to people's experiences, but also the activities of the apartheid military structures within Botswana. So that their own attacks within Botswana itself became very clear, very evident, and friends of ours that were killed in the process, and people who were hurt very badly and traumatized. So the ravages of apartheid and its security apparatus became very, very evident from about 1980 onwards, and never ceased. And that's the life we led, and we then grew to understand it and grew to understand it a little bit better, but cope with it better. And it was finding coping mechanisms of dealing with that brutality.
And what age did you go into exile?
Uh, I was 21, I think. 21.
And so it after a period after you moved into exile in Botswana, you also then went and spent some time in Angola doing military training. And I want to know, what was the effect of your military training and the exposure that you had to that war-torn country on your beliefs about how apartheid should be ended?
Yeah, yeah. Very good question, because when we got to Angola in beginning of 1980, uh, Luanda was quite a destroyed city, very much like Mogadishu, which I spent a lot of time in. You see the effects of urban warfare and the impact on the environment, the buildings, and so on. And Angola was essentially a, a country in war. The bush was very much an area where warfare was common and widespread. We had difficulties dealing with UNITA in Angola and so on. So it clearly made a huge impact on us in terms of understanding, really, our political understanding of countries in conflict and what happens. From the ANC point of view, they'd begun to understand also that very little came out of war itself, in that conflicts were never resolved on the battlefield. Conflicts were resolved off the battlefield and in negotiations rather than in battle. It was also in 1979 that Oliver Tambo went with a very senior delegation of ANC leaders to Vietnam. And this is a lesson they came back from Vietnam with, in terms of how to conduct struggle more at a political level, even though it was armed, uh, but the political requirements of it. But they also understood they, that, Vietnam, like Algeria, like a number of other countries, resolved their conflicts around a table, not around the battlefield. So the way in which one conducted war was in a different way, and the strategy and the tactics one applied was totally different. And so it wasn't full blown warfare as such as in military with actions with a very, very clear political understanding and impact. So that changed a whole lot of things. I learned that again long after that, and when I started doing international work in countries like Libya, in Somalia, in Yemen, where you see the ravages of countries in conflict, and you begin to understand, uh, you know, it's an exposure to the war-torn countries which help one understand that, how to manage the end to conflict, and that the importance of finding a way in which to bring parties to a table in a way in which we'll find a resolution that is of benefit to all of the people in a country.
I'm going to skip forward a bit through a few years of your life to after you've attained your law degree from the University of Edinburgh, and you work as an advocate. You come back to Botswana and you work as an advocate within Botswana. But at the same time, you were building and developing the ANC underground even more, and you started to really amp things up and focus on the as you mentioned, the kind of politically targeted military activities. And so, what underground structures were you developing, and what were the goals for these structures?
Yeah, I think that's very important. Bear in mind that Botswana was one part of the frontline states. Frontline states were all those countries bordering on South Africa, in which the ANC had a presence, and the ANC established leadership structures in each of these frontline states so as to spearhead its activities within the country. So our responsibility was to engage people in a country under the leadership of what we call regional political military committees. So we established regional political military committees uh, and as a basis on which to recruit uh, people, establish structures, and give leadership to the activities within the country. And it is then that political work was ramped up, as you say, and we became extremely successful. Because bear in mind, I qualified roughly in about 1986 with my law degree, and then whilst in law practice, which was a perfect front for me, uh, allowed me that guise of that front of security to be able to then carry out activities at night. We were incredibly successful then. The number of structures we were able to establish were incredibly successful, and we divided the country into different territories. And so ours was our responsibility was essentially from if you like, from Bridge in Zimbabwe, going right down south to the border of the Free State and coming up towards a Namibian border. And so it was a huge border, a huge territory. So it had part of Limpopo, all of Gauteng, and a part of what is currently Northwest. And that was a territory within which we had to work and establish structures. So we established structures, political structures, military structures, and undertook our activities based on the programs of the ANC as it was.
And what were some of the activities?
Well, we had four pillars of our struggle. The first pillar was, or not the first pillar, one pillar was international work, which we weren't really involved in. We were more involved in the internal. So internal was the underground structures, and then the military. So we had underground political structures, we had military structures, and then we had support for the mass democratic movement. And so those were the three other pillars. So essentially, that's what guided our strategy and our tactics in terms of how we undertook our activities. So a lot of our activities were involved in engaging with people in civil society and structures of the mass democratic movement, later on also the UDF and various other community organizations, trade unions, civic organizations, engaging them, exchanging ideas with them, also imparting an understanding of our strategy and tactics, a perspective of the ANC in terms of how to deal with apartheid, how to deal with the government, how to resist, and also ideas in terms of what the future should look like. So we did that, dealing with the mass democratic movement. In the political structures, we established structures throughout the country, and particularly in the area of our responsibility, establishing units far and wide, and then some of them were actively engaged in military efforts, which also proved to be incredibly successful as well.
So one of the things that I was thinking about when I went through your book is that, and as you talk now about the kind of importance of the mass democratic movement, but the fact that the ANC for a very long time struggled to get a foothold within them. In your book, you have mentioned numerous cases of people who spent a very long time trying to join the ANC. And so, do you believe the ANC's underground structures were necessary to bring the apartheid government to the negotiating table? And how were they necessary, if so, if you do believe that?
No, I do believe that. Uh, Clearly, until the early 80s, the ANC structures, the underground structures, were pretty weak in the country. Uh, there's also a reality that underground structures never survived for very long. So many underground structures had limited lifespan. Security made things very difficult. Uh, and people moved on and did other things. But it became very difficult in the underground. Uh, and it was only, after about 82, 83, when things started improving in terms of establishment of structures, where recruitment took place much more vigorously, where establishment of new units were much more robust, and the activities started ramping up. But a lot of that came about because of the activity of the mass democratic movement, because the mass democratic movement increased the political consciousness of people in the country because they operated legally. And that increased the political consciousness of the young people, captured their imagination. And our responsibility was then to be able to ensure that we would be able to reach out to those, that we would be able to provide an understanding and a political perspective with which they could then effectively carry and undertake their work. But more importantly, then identified from amongst those people, people who could be recruited into ANC structures. And so recruitment was very, very specific. It wasn't just recruiting for the sake of recruiting. It's not as if it was a political party of selling ANC membership. Back then, you recruited the best and you found people who were most appropriate for particular activities and for particular structures and for particular responsibilities. So we were very deliberate in the people we recruited and what structures we put them into.
And I want to start moving on to the period just preceding the negotiations. And so I think my first question about this period is, when did you return to South Africa, and what was it like returning home after spending so much of your adult life in exile?
Yeah, yeah. It was amazing, absolutely amazing. We couldn't believe. Well, I had two different feelings. One, we were becoming extremely successful in activities that we had just at the time of the 1989 and then 1990 when Madiba was released. Uh, and the ANC was unbanned. It was when we became extremely successful and powerful. So in part, we wanted to continue that effort. So unbanning was this the ceasefire, the unbanning, all of those activities were not things we appreciated at that point in time. But at the same time, coming home and interacting with people at home gave us a new perspective. It was incredible. It was an incredible experience, and the issue then was establishing the ANC in its legal format and structure. And so that's so when we came back, the big issue was then what did we then do in terms of changing our course of our activities, and what would we then do? And for me, uh, it was getting involved in CODESA. I was asked to be part of some delegations, and we started the process in 1991 and got involved in some of the early negotiations. Initially, it was under the auspices of the Transvaal Indian Congress. So we got involved immediately in the negotiations process.
And before we get right into the negotiation process, I just have a couple of questions about the setting up of the ANC after the end of after the unbanning. So, how did you manage to so quickly set up the ANC as a legal organization, considering, the fact that between 1990 and 1994, you went from not existing to being the governing party after the 27th of April 1994?
By 1991, I was recruited into the ANC's regional structure. Back then, it wasn't Gauteng, it was called the PWV, or Pretoria Witwatersrand Verenigen region. And I was a regional organizer, and my responsibility was then to establish ANC branches in the different communities. So we would then go into each of the areas, identify the ANC people, and then organize them into structures, then put them into branches. I think we it was arising out of the 1991 ANC conference, the first conference of the ANC. The importance was to establish the ANC as a legal structure which had membership. So there's a big push to gain membership. And at that point in time, membership cost all of 12 Rand. And so the big change in the ANC was then recruiting people who wanted to join the ANC rather than recruiting people who had particular political beliefs. So yes, everybody at that time was talking the ANC language. It was very popular and so on. But we didn't recruit as we did in the underground. We recruited by way of membership, buying of membership. And the big issue was then to gain as many branches in as many communities as possible, establish the regional structures legally, and then the national structures, and to go into elections on that basis. So you needed a branch, a footwork, a network of branches of the ANC as legal structures, and that became an imperative, yes.
And do you think that the push to get as many members to join the ANC as quickly as possible left open the door for opportunists who could see that being a part of the new governing party might be a good thing?
Absolutely. I think it's something I understood much later, was that before the capture of the state took place, there was a capture of ANC branches that took place. And so capture of the state was made possible by people operating within ANC structures. And opportunists, people who saw great opportunity by the ANC and understood that it would become a governing party, sort of embedded themselves in it only because it gave them levers or access to power. Initially, it was political access to opinion makers and power, and later, of course, it then matured into also access into decision making, which would lead to economic value. But what took place in various communities, including mine, was the fact that our branches were hijacked and were captured by people who didn't share our political views, people who knew very little of the Freedom Charter, what our beliefs were, what our value systems were. And so that, in a sense, opening up membership did open that door. And a practice we saw then, which has become very much prevalent in recent years and understood for all its sins, was that those who wanted to be elected would effectively buy membership cards for people and dish them out and allow them to vote in a particular way. And that's how they rose to particular levels of power. So yes, it had its benefits, but it had its serious disadvantages and impact on the ANC, the country, and what happened to governance later. So yes, how the branches were established were an important aspect of our country's history, which hopefully will get re-examined at some point, or examined at some point, and properly understood for what it was.
But to move back, because at that point we haven't yet, at the point in which we're talking about now, we haven't yet seen the kind of long-term impact of this opening up of the gates yet. So I'm interested in, you mentioned earlier that you came back and it was straight into preparation for CODESA. So how did the ANC prepare in the lead up to the first set of CODESA negotiations?
Useful aspect to delve into it. Essentially, we were guided by ANC values, statements, policy decisions, and so on. We were guided by decisions of the National Executive Committee and how it dealt with things. The ANC managed this process by establishing what it referred to as a negotiations commission. The negotiations commission was chaired by the Secretary General of the ANC, who was then Cyril Ramaphosa, now the president. His deputy was Jacob Zuma, and in that negotiations commission had a number of key leaders from the ANC who sat in the negotiations commission, developed positions for negotiations, would get those positions approved by the NEC. But before they did so, there was a process of consultations that took place. A process of consultations, there was an engagement of the mass democratic movement, and engaging the different structures in the country, so as to ensure that the policies, the positions that were undertaken in negotiations were positions that would be broadly accepted and would be welcomed and supported by the broader majority, but also accepted and understood.
But as the historical record shows, the CODESA negotiations were unsuccessful. And so, in your opinion, what was the key error in the CODESA negotiations? Why did they fail?
Well, I wouldn't say it did fail. I think it's somewhat different. CODESA 1 succeeded with the major statement that was made at CODESA 1, and that laid the basis for CODESA 2. CODESA 2 started in all earnest and carried on until 1992, when we had the Boipatong massacre, and we had a few massacres, and you had the activities of the third force, which led to the breakdown of negotiations, and that's when CODESA collapsed, essentially. So I'm not sure if it failed, but it collapsed because there was a stalemate, there was a deadlock. The third force activities, violence in the country became really incredible and out of hand, and what it needed to be dealt with. So in that climate of violence, the ANC found it could not continue negotiations any further. You had the assassination of Chris Hani, you had the Bishu massacre, the Boipatong massacre, and arising from all of that, the ANC found that it had to break the process of negotiations. And it then restarted the process through the channel bilaterals, and that negotiations process got restarted in what was then referred to, because people didn't want CODESA 1, CODESA 2, and CODESA 3. It was then referred to as a multi-party negotiation process, only because there was different configuration of parties also involved. Because in CODESA 1 and 2, some of the parties, the right-wing parties, were not party to that. So they didn't want to be party to a CODESA structure. And so effectively what took place is that a new structure was established, in which those previous right-wing parties and the IFP, which didn't participate in the negotiations, then participated in the multi-party negotiations process. So yes, it morphed into different vehicles, as it were, for negotiations, because the requirements were different.
And what was your role during the MPNP?
You're referring to personally?
Yes.
My personal role?
Yes.
Or the ANC's role? Okay. at a personal level, I was not directly involved in the MPNP except for the way in which I would support the ANC structures in the MPNP. So I worked for the Negotiations Commission. Effectively, I was the administrator and essentially translating what the decisions were into actual action. My responsibility was to ensure that our engagement in the structure in the various forums were done in an effective and a proper way. So I would provide support to that particular process. So it wasn't directly sitting at a negotiating table, but really supporting those who were sitting at the negotiating table so as to ensure that they were able to do their work effectively.
And did you attempt to influence people's kind of beliefs about what should be included in the Constitution, despite the fact that your role was mainly to oversee and coordinate the negotiations?
I think at that point in time, the ANC operated in a much more open way rather than in a structured and hierarchical way. So in negotiations meetings, I would be allowed to make any comment or statement that I thought was appropriate. And sometimes I would do also research and contribute to the discussions and provide support to the discussion. So yes, I wouldn't quite put it as influence or whatever, but effectively I was part of the Negotiations Commission, albeit technically at an administrative level and providing that support. But part of that would be to engage in the discussions, in the political discussions and shaping the thoughts, ideas and processes. Remember also that part of it was based on the Negotiations Commission engagement with civil society. So a lot of that responsibility was mine. A lot of the conveyance of the information. We produced newsletters, briefings, and those newsletters and briefings would be documents I would prepare. We would distribute them, engage with establish forums of these structures, mass democratic movement structures, and allow for an opportunity for the ANC to engage with them so as to discuss the various positions that we were taking and how we were dealing with things. So it was part of taking people on board and dealing with negotiations effectively.
And what were the particularly important issues to you that you kind of felt as though you needed to get across and debate and have included by the negotiation teams?
I think a lot of the discussions related to effectively the Bill of Rights, if you ask me, Bill of Rights, and it also dealt with the process issues, in the sense that remember that at CODESA or the multi-party negotiations process, we weren't immediately negotiating a new government. We were negotiating a government, an interim government that, even though at that early stages it wasn't understood and accepted to be an interim government, that concept came only in 1993. But effectively, the discussions would be really related to the positioning of the ANC and the progressive structures within not only the negotiations but also in government, so as to ensure one, an imperative at that point in time was to prevent an escalation of the violence that was going really out of hand, but two, positioning ourselves in a way in which to be able to make an impact not only on a democratic government but also on the transitioning. So you'll find big issues come through. So concepts of the Independent Electoral Commission, a big issue for Black people generally and all democratic organizations, was to ensure that the elections were never controlled and managed by the government. It was managed through an independent electoral commission. And so that's where the IEC came about. Then you'll find that also there was a big push to ensure that the media was also done in an independent way and they were afforded an opportunity to operate. So you had independent media structure, so control over the SABC and state media outlets had to be done in a way in which afforded and allowed for independence. And so that became quite a big issue as well. So there were a number of big issues in terms of managing the transition, managing the process, but also issues of Bill of Rights came to the fore as well.
And did the ANC view itself as having the upper hand in the negotiations, especially after the date was set for the first elections?
Yeah. I'm not sure if one would refer to it in that way. I think it was the negotiations was a battle on a different front and a new front. But the ANC was confident. The ANC was incredibly strong at that point in time. If you remember that we in response to the various massacres and so on, we had this whole campaign of rolling mass action where people were engaged in struggles on the street. And so effectively we were dealing with issues at the negotiating table which the people in the streets were dealing with on their feet, as it were, and in day-to-day struggles. So it became quite a robust and a major thing. So it's not so much that the ANC felt as if it was in the upper hand, but it was in a strong position and it needed to place itself in as strong a position as possible so as to ensure that its ability at the negotiating table was strengthened. And its strength could only be viewed in effect with people struggling on the ground and those struggles becoming quite evidently in support of the negotiations process.
Before we move to the shift in your role post the elections, I'm wondering what are the moments that particularly stand out in your memory from the MPNP times?
There were quite a few actually. MPNP. I think it was also at that time when of course the AWB crashed into the Kempton Park premises where negotiations were being undertaken, dealing with the ideas of an interim government and interim constitution were fairly major issues and very different. I think we dealt with difficult issues when it came to matters of the division of South Africa, because there was a big debate at that point in time called the Big F debate, was whether there should be federalism or not, and the question of how South Africa would be divided. And the concept was then, originally the position that we undertook or we took was that the same four provinces that existed should maintain itself. And the key issue was to ensure the economic sustainability of those different entities that were accepted. But these were very loaded arguments for minority parties, because minority parties were not very strong throughout the country. And how you divided the country would determine how strong parties would be and how they would fare in the elections. So, for argument's sake, IFP would fare better in the KwaZulu-Natal area, and they would argue for more greater autonomy or independence, as it was then, for KwaZulu-Natal. The National Party argued very strongly for a situation in which the Western Cape would be an entity that would be autonomous in their own right. So you had different pulls and pushes and pressures on the process. And effectively, there was then the decision or the compromise that there should be 9 provinces. But also there was a decision that because of these compromises that were undertaken, we should have really what would be then an interim constitution, because the principle that the ANC got involved in the negotiations process was that the constitution could only be adopted by a democratically elected people. So if you put in a constitution before, it would not hold any democratic value. And so the compromise was to have an interim constitution that was elected, that was guided, that you'd have an election, an interim constitution, you'd elect a government, which would be an interim government. That government would rule according to the basis of that interim constitution. And during that period, the final constitution could then be negotiated. And then, of course, the issue was really to get compromises done so as to ensure certain agreements reached during the negotiations could not be changed afterwards. The minority parties felt very strong about that because they felt that their ability to negotiate positions during the multi-party negotiating process was stronger than after the election, because after the election, they feared that their strength in parliament or in a constitutional assembly would not be as great as it was during the multi-party negotiations process. So you found a tension that took place, and that led to the basis on which compromises really had to take place and for the process to move forward.
You actually outline 3 compromises that you are unhappy with in the interim constitution in your book, and you talked about one of them now, that the 9 provinces. You also talked about the size of the legislative bodies and the PR list system. And I want to focus on the PR list system because, as you point out, it alienates public representatives from the constituencies that they should be serving. And I'm really interested to know, how did this compromise come about?
Well, it was a basic compromise in the sense that remember that the ANC would have benefited from a direct accountability at that point in time. Proportional representation favored the minority parties that did not have a presence everywhere. So the National Party and the Democratic Party, before it became the Democratic Alliance, uh, were spread about in a way in which they would not effectively be able to succeed in electing very many people if it was done on a direct basis. So part of the compromise was to give them that opportunity so as to have a presence and to ensure that they wouldn't be left out, was to have proportional representation. So it was very much a way in which the minority parties would be given a better opportunity to become part of government. I think at that point in time, it was everybody's understanding that it would be better to have people in the government rather than out of the government. And in a sense, you'd want a broad framework or a broad church, if you like, within and supporting the process of the transition. Otherwise, support of the transition would be limited and it would not have maintained or sustained itself. So proportional representation was an important part of that compromise. Uh, I think looking back at it, it may not have been something that, it's something that ought to be reviewed, and hopefully the current debates and discussions will help in that regard. But it's generally accepted that proportional representation is not suitable as an effective electoral system in our country.
I would agree with that, especially given the fact that there are plenty of municipalities that are in need of direct supervision, and there's no incentive to be involved in them.
Well, part of the compromises that took place was that effectively what happened in negotiations is that creating nine provinces and then subsequent negotiations that created so many local government structures created a great deal of government structures. The result is that that's what also opened the process. It offered minority parties a greater opportunity of being party to government, but it also offered a greater opportunity for opportunists also to get in and resulting in the type of difficulties in governance that we currently have. So yes, proportional representation was a big issue. It's something that hopefully people in the current debates will attend to in an effective way. because direct accountability is really what I think a lot of people are calling out for.
And so I'm going to move us then to post the elections. So we have this interim constitution established, and the first universal democratic elections on 27th of April 1994. And then you become part of the Gauteng legislature, but then very quickly you are offered, are asked to apply for the role of executive director of the Constitutional Assembly, which you then become. And what did this role entail?
In effect, currently in Parliament, you have a post called a Secretary of Parliament, the person who manages Parliament. The executive director of the Constitutional Assembly was really the mirror image of that, in the sense that we were dealing with the same grouping of people who were in Parliament, but in a different structure called the Constitutional Assembly, because there was Parliament made up of the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces as one structure, but both those structures, the people from both those structures also served in their capacity in the Constitutional Assembly when they sat as a Constitutional Assembly. So while for Parliament you had a Secretary of Parliament, the opposite number for the Constitutional Assembly was the Executive Director. So my responsibility was to manage all the activities of the Constitutional Assembly, which meant both houses of Parliament sitting together and organizing them into the structures that would enable them to effectively undertake their negotiations. That effectively got morphed and changed by one of the early decisions, which then changed the course of history in constitution making, not only in South Africa, but in the world, was a decision in one of the early meetings of the Constitutional Assembly to ensure that the Constitution was adopted after consulting the public. So we were then instructed not only to manage a process of negotiations, but also manage a process of consultations that would take place with the broader public, and therefore a public participation program which would then enrich or then flow into the negotiations process. So, in effect, was managing the Constitutional Assembly, whether it be in its negotiations, whether it be in its public participation, and of course, all the logistic and administrative responsibilities that went with it.
Although I believe you managed to execute this role with an incredible amount of aplomb, there was one moment that stood out to me in which there was a little bit of awkwardness. So can you please take me through what happened at your first meeting of the Constitutional Committee?
After, towards, I think it would have been about September 1994, September, October, if not a little later. The Constitutional Assembly, we had put together an administrative structure to support the Constitutional Assembly. We developed a program. We developed a program of activities for the Constitutional Assembly, identified structures that the Constitutional Assembly would operate in, being theme committees and so on, and then established a full-fledged plan, which would then plot out how the Constitution would be negotiated. And my responsibility was to present that plan, which we had worked on for a couple of months, come back to the Constitutional Committee to get it approved. And of course, technology being what it was at that point in time, we didn't have our overhead we didn't have normal projectors where we would deal with PowerPoint slides, and PowerPoint slides were not as effective as it is today. So the technology was quite backdated, outdated, or rather in its infant stage, and involved a number of different pieces of equipment with an overhead projector, and it would allow me to then project slides explaining really the whole plan. And without, of course, my nervousness with it all led to me tripping over the many cables that were there to put all of this equipment together. And everything, of course, came crashing down. I think it was pure luck that I wasn't given any hard time by it. In fact, the entire Constitutional Committee became quite sympathetic to my challenge that I was facing, gave me an opportunity, and then offered me the opportunity to then present the presentation orally without the benefit of having slides. Uh, but I think they all felt quite sorry for me. And feeling sorry for me made it easier for them to accept the plan and the program that I had. And they went with it. And I built up a very good relationship after that with most members of the Constitutional Assembly, irrespective of which political party they belong to. We built up a relationship of respect and enjoyed a working relationship that allowed us to get work done, even in the most difficult of times. So it was a good start, a difficult start to a very good process.
You were also insistent in this role in having active public participation, especially after the agreement that this is what you needed. And so, how did you go about engaging the public in the constitution making process, which is typically quite a dry, very kind of legal and political process? And why was this so important to you?
Bear in mind, until then in history, no country had undertaken a constitution making process or review process other than it being done in exclusive rooms, usually with only males, smoke filled rooms, and the elite of the elite. And that's how the constitutions were generally negotiated. We broke that mold. We broke that mold by involving ordinary people. Ordinary people, we devised, I thought was even now, was somewhat clever ways, even though we didn't have the technology of social media, which would have been really effective. But we created ways in which to involve people through a process of first of educating the public of what the process was, so people understood the process and what the issues were. And thirdly, we did so in a way in which involved all the political parties, so nobody felt that what the messages that we were conveying were messages that were politically biased or favoring one party or another. So we did so in quite an effective way. We educated the public, but then got them to get involved. And initially, it was by way of petitions, submissions, and engagement. And then later, also, it became involved. It grew into actual meetings where we would engage with civil society structures and structures of the community throughout the country. So we developed a community liaison program. And in this community liaison program, it would allow us to take politicians from the Constitutional Assembly into a community and provide a report in a town hall setup where we would give a report of what the developments were taking place in the Constitution and then inviting them to prepare or present ideas from the floor, and people would then be offered an opportunity to give their opinions and views on different things. This gave a unique opportunity to politicians, even those politicians who were previously involved in a parliament, mainly the white parties, gave them an opportunity to engage in public participation, which never was done before. So it offered everybody that opportunity. And the unique thing was that taking multi party groupings into all communities, irrespective of what political affiliation or alignment those communities were, and gave them an opportunity to hear and sense and feel what people wanted and what their thoughts were. In a sense, it humbled people. It humbled people because it gave people an understanding that constitutions were about people and their experiences and their lives, and it wasn't that those matters that purely affected the intellectuals who could deal with the academics and so on, and that constitutions was about the people and had to be the people had to be party to it and involved in it. And so that experience essentially changed the way in which the world looked at constitutions, whether it be review or making of new constitutions, and even facilitation of conflicts, which would result in legal agreements in many parts of the world. So, fascinating experience. Clearly, one of the best experiences that ever had as working. Both as a lawyer, but also as a political person, but also uh, in terms of experience. We charted new territory. We were able to do so successfully, and as yeah, a source of great and immense pride to all of the people in the team, which for me is what really made it. We had a, we had a very small team of people that was responsible for this. And without the team that I had, it would not have been possible to actually undertake the grandiose program that we had. So we were very fortunate. We had a good team, a team that was focused with a clear vision. They knew what they needed to do, and they were able to execute it. So I'm very grateful for that.
How do you think that the public participation impacted the final constitution?
Very big, very big. There's a couple of ways in which it literally crept into the constitution. So I remember the debates very clearly on the making processes in Parliament, and how Parliament went about preparing legislation for approval. And I remember the debates and the discussions of politicians saying that it is a critical requirement that Parliament must henceforth only prepare and approve legislation that had the opportunity of public participation and engagement. And we've seen the effect and the benefit of that, because we've seen a number of pieces of legislation in the last number of years being taken to the Constitutional Court only because there wasn't enough public participation on it. So public support for legislation then became an embedded aspect for the future, and will ever be so, only because of the experience of the constitution making. So yes, it had a dramatic impact. The way in which Parliament operated, we changed the way in which Parliament operated effectively, and took out the elitism and made it much more structured, organized, in a better sense of participation. So committees of parliament would effectively, and were structured in a way in which to ensure that even minority parties would be able to participate in committees of parliament. So where minority parties did not have enough people to be present in all of the different committees of parliament, they now were offered better opportunities. And that's the influence of the constitution making process itself, as well as a public participation program. So we're very grateful for that. And so in a sense, there's a bit of a signature and a footprint of our experience in the constitution, and I'm confident that it will uh, not be diminished. In fact, it will grow, but it's also grown in other constitutions and in other countries. And I think that's something that's worth noting.
And so, my last question about the final constitution, as someone who was there overseeing the process, in your book, you describe you and your team were kind of the midwife that helped give birth to the final constitution. What were the significant debates regarding the final constitution that differed from the debates about the interim constitution?
Yeah. Well, significant debates. There were lots of significant debates, but the debates that became deadlocks were the important debates. Strangely enough, those debates were not major political issues. They were issues relating to the strike and the lockout decision, related to property clause, uh, related to education. Uh, so it was a totally different flavor. It wasn't on what people would normally associate with major constitutional issues. What became important at that point in time, and deadlock breaking issues, were really the question of education, medium of language in education, the question of the lockout clause and so on. And you can clearly see the different interests coming to play in finalizing that constitution. And those were very difficult times. But yes, very different from what academics and politicians thought would be the issues, the major issues to deal with.
I've got two last questions for you before we wrap up. So they're both your personal takes on things. But firstly, what are you most proud of having contributed to South Africa's constitution making process?
Yeah, I think there's a couple, but the most important thing for me is never before in the history of constitution making was process understood to be important, because process was never an issue. Process was always taken out of the equation. Go back right to the American Constitution and thereafter. Process was never an issue. They put a group of people into smoke-filled rooms, locked them up, and allowed them to actually debate and discuss the Constitution, and came out, and that was it. There was no process beyond that. What our experience did was that we changed the language from drafting a constitution to making a constitution. And so constitutions were never just drafted by politicians telling lawyers what to draft, and that's what came to Parliament for approval, like legislation would. So it was never just drafted, it was made. Constitutions were made. And that was a fundamental shift from all of the past processes of constitution making or constitutionalism. We changed that. And that I'm incredibly proud of. It's something we take to the rest of the world, and the world is very eager to understand, learn, and experience that experience, and pursue and perpetuate that. Because until then, the only mechanism people used for support for constitutions were referenda. We dealt with the constitution before a referendum. Instead of a referendum, we got the people involved and in a process. So the process was a credible one. So the credibility of the process impacted on the credibility of the constitution. So with the credibility of the constitution, the process also took in the transparency and the openness of the meetings. So our meetings were different from all other meetings, and that's what has impacted on Parliament as well, and the way in which Parliament operates. It was different because none of our constitution making meetings were in secret. There was no longer any secret meetings. So it became an absolute exception to have meetings that were undertaken without the public being party to it. So that was an exception rather than the norm. So the norm was that constitution making and law making should be in the full glare of the public, so that the public knew and they could attend, and they could, secondly, participate in and engage. And that's another footprint that I'm very, very, very proud of. It's something that the world has taken note of. There are other aspects of the constitution making that I'm very proud of, which is our constitution is architected in a particular way. The language we used was plain language. We also broke the mold of previous constitutions. Our constitution was the first that was drafted in plain English language, or plain language. It was done in other languages as well. So plain language used in a constitution, because it was accepted that constitutions are there for everybody to understand, and therefore it must be in a language that people would understand. So we took that out. There's a third point about it, which is the gender sensitivity. So you'll find that our constitution is gender sensitive. In the main, we don't refer to he or she, but we refer to a gender neutral term. And where we needed to say he or she, we would alternate. So we would alternate he or she, so that gender sensitivity was understood. Then it is not only in the language, but the architecture of the Constitution. If you look at the way in which a Constitution is architected, it is unique throughout the world. it sets new standards and something to be incredibly proud of and something that we contribute to. So, for argument's sake, you ask yourself what is the first thing that the Constitution deals with in the Constitution? And it's simply two words: human dignity. And so, right at the beginning of the Constitution, in the first clause, you'll find human dignity being there. And there's a fundamental historical and political reason why human dignity was put first as the major issue in the Constitution, because human dignity was what was violated in the past. And that sets the difference. So if you look at the Constitution and its architecture, there's a whole lot that can be said about it, in the way in which the chapters are divided, organized, and structured. I think played a role which today is a best practice throughout the world. Having been party to that process of discussion, uh, I'm very grateful and very proud to have been to have participated in it. Towards the end, my role beyond just being an administrator, executive director, before the Constitution was approved or adopted in the Constitution and went into final adoption, it needed to be vetted. And to be vetted, we needed to make sure that the Constitution was consistent and how the cross-referencing in the Constitution took place, how it was structured and so on. That was done in a committee called the Technical Refinement Committee. And I chaired that process. It's something that I'm very proud of having done. And I sat together with all of the political parties, supported by the legal staff, and we went through clause by clause, looking at it, looking at the language, looking at the structure, without interfering with the politics of it, but making sure that it is a document that today we are very proud of. And that was something that I'll forever be pleased to have been party to.
And I think you should definitely be pleased and proud of everything that you contributed to it, because it's after having gotten involved in this process of talking to some of the people who wrote it, I can't help but feel proud that I got to grow up in the democratic South Africa with that as our guide. And so with with that thought in mind, I think that leads us perfectly into my last question, which is, why does the Constitution remain an important document to all South Africans today?
It does remain so. And it remains so because there's not a day in any of the media that you can have discussions or debates that doesn't relate to a constitutional issue. If you look at the number of cases coming before our courts and our constitutional court, which we can be incredibly proud of. If you look at the jurisprudence coming out of our constitutional court, it is jurisprudence that's really exciting and groundbreaking and something that makes the Constitution relevant. The importance of the Constitution is its relevance to ordinary people. Very rarely in developed countries would people debate the Constitution. In our country, people debate the Constitution continuously because we are a developing country, a developing nation, a country in the process of evolving continuously. And because we are continuously evolving, making mistakes, doing the right things, doing the wrong things, but because people are participating, people are acutely aware and continuously take ownership of the Constitution. And that's the important thing. The Constitution remains an important document to all South Africans because the Constitution is owned by the people. It's owned by the people, and without a doubt, I'm fully confident that if the Constitution is under attack, then it is the people who will defend it. So the Constitution, I believe, is a document that's continuously relevant to our people and for the future. People understand its value. Traveling through the even developed countries, you don't find the same sense of attachment that people would have to the Constitution as we would have. We debate it so vigorously, we discuss it, we argue about it. But in most countries, in developed countries, it doesn't really matter. People just get on. People don't even, in fact, know what is in the constitution. In South Africa, people actually have come to learn to understand it, and people debate it and discuss it, which incidentally is just one anecdote which I must part with now, which is that when we were in the process of concluding and completing the constitution, we had a very interesting discussion just on the side. And I was discussing this matter with the deputy chairperson of the Constitutional Assembly, Leon Wessels. And he said to me, Hassen, listen, wouldn't it be great if this constitution could be made into a small booklet so that we could put it in our jacket, and even at dinner, if people are talking, people would quickly take out the constitution and refer to it without it being a big document that's not very accessible. And so we made a point of it. So when the constitution was finally adopted, we printed 11 million copies in all 11 languages, and we distributed it. It was the first time it was ever done, and we made sure it was a document that became accessible, but also lent itself to being owned by the people. And that's what I think, why I think this document is so important, and why we as South Africans, notwithstanding all the difficulties we currently have and all the political drama that takes place, the Constitution remains a fundamental document which everybody supports. And if I can add one point to that, which is simply this, that irrespective of the debate that takes place in a country, whether it is communists or people who are an extreme right wing, nobody challenges the authenticity, the value, or the legitimacy of the Constitution. We just debate different things in the Constitution. We don't challenge the Constitution itself. So the Constitution is long past being challenged. Issues in the Constitution are being challenged, and that's fair game. But I think, irrespective of political persuasion, people respect the Constitution. That's probably one of the very, very important things alongside ownership of the Constitution. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Ebrahim. Your book is called From Marabastad to Mogadishu, and I think that the country can only be thankful that your journey did begin in Marabastad, because your contribution to this country, I think, is certainly immense, and it was such a privilege and an honor to talk to you today. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure, and thank you very much.